and welcome to the 5th annual CTMS lecture at the University of Winnipeg. My name is Aileen Friesen, and I am the co-director for the center, and I will also be the moderator for this evening's event. We are presenting this lecture live from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is located on the ancestral and traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe, the Assiniboine, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and the heartland of the Métis Nation, a fact that is too often overlooked or marginalized in the telling of Mennonite history in Manitoba. CTMS is a research center that is a partnership between the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation and the Chair in Mennonite Studies. It supports the study of Mennonites within a transnational context. Under normal conditions, we would hold our annual lecture in person, but to make it feel a little bit more social than just staring at a screen, please feel free to put in your greetings and other chats to people using the chat function. Some of you might even want to play the Mennonite game, but we take no responsibility for you finding any relatives that you wish you hadn't. But for questions about the lecture, please use the question and answer button instead, and put any of your questions that you think of as the lecture proceeds in that, and I will be monitoring it and will then give those questions over to our presenter today. So tonight I have the pleasure of introducing the other co-director of the center and the new chair in Mennonite Studies at the university, Dr. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen. As we were thinking about this lecture, we normally invite people to give it, but it seemed appropriate to have Ben give this lecture this evening, not only because he has a brand new book out, Landscape of Migration, Mobility and Environmental Change on Bolivia's Tropical Frontier since 1952, out with University of North Carolina Press, but also because many of you haven't met Ben due to COVID. He's been at the university for a year now, but you haven't been able to see him. And so we thought that this might be a nice way to introduce you to Ben and to get to know his research more broadly. Now, I met Ben for the first time in Amsterdam when we were both young, aspiring researchers on the 7 Points on Earth project. And I remember being very impressed with his keen intellect and also his easygoing nature. And I was so excited when he agreed to join the team at University of Winnipeg. Ben received his PhD from Emory University, and he has numerous publications exploring the history of Mennonites in Latin America. He's also recently been awarded a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada Insight Grant for a new project. But today he will be discussing his first book, which I encourage you to pick up. And his presentation is titled A Transnational Revolution, Mennonites and Bolivia's March to the East. So I'm going to now hand it over to Dr. Ben Nobbs-Thiessen.
Thank you so much, Aileen, for that nice introduction. And I also want to acknowledge ancestral and traditional territories, Indigenous peoples here in Winnipeg, and also add, given the subject of the talk this evening, that settler colonialism on Bolivia's eastern lowland frontier, specifically in the Department of Santa Cruz, I'll be discussing tonight, took place on the traditional homelands of the Guarani, Ayarreo, Siriono, Gorayo, and Chiquitano Indigenous peoples, groups that have largely been silenced in the March to the East, the subject I'll be discussing tonight, but that since the late 1970s have been involved in the reconstitution and defense of autonomous Indigenous territories. So I'll share my screen here as I have a few images I'd like to put up. And I want to begin our talk tonight with a memory from a US diplomatic staff, a Consul William Dietrichs, who was stationed in the city of Santa Cruz de la Sierra in the 1970s. In looking back on his time there in a pretty remote frontier region down on the eastern plains of Bolivia, you can kind of get a sense of the topography from this map on the left. Dietrichs remembers it, as a pretty unique experience. He describes meeting the daily plane from La Paz, the administrative capital in the highlands, that came down to the Santa Cruz airport. to El Trompillo. You can see an image here I dug up from a plane landing there in the 1970s, as an experience in diversity, although he says, I don't think we use the word yet. He remembers difference through dress, and he recalls that on a good day, quote, and this is a quote from him, alongside city residents in sports shirts, he would encounter groups of Indigenous Highlanders in their bowler hats and ponchos, Japanese settlers with a young girl in a kimono, perhaps carrying a bouquet of flowers, and overalled, poke-bonneted Mennonites. And that same diversity is apparent if you went out to the rural regions of Santa Cruz Department in that era. And so here I've got a map produced at the time, and you can get a sense for the diverse sort of settler landscape of this region. The Methodist Mission Board under Robert Caulfield decided to build a rural institute in Monteros. This is about 70 kilometers north of Santa Cruz, precisely because they saw it, in their words, as an axis of operation. They could travel out and visit colonies, whose origins, if you look at the dates and origins on the right-hand side of the screen, might reflect Indigenous Highlanders that had come down to the region, to the tropical frontier, Okinawan and Japanese settlers, and Mennonites, right, through the 1950s and 1960s. So they planned to do outreach with these various groups. My own interest, sort of reflects those realizations of Dietrich's and the Caulfields in their work in Santa Cruz, that being in this region, researching this region meant the ability in a single day to travel out by car, for instance, a long day, albeit from Santa Cruz, and visit colonies, whose residents might be primary Aymara and Quechua speakers, the main languages of the highlands of the Andes in Bolivia. They might be Low German speakers who've grown up in Chihuahua, Mexico, or La Crete up in Alberta, or perhaps in other regions that Mennonites had settled in, or they might trace their lineage back to Okinawa or to the main islands of Japan. And so I thought, looking at these three populations alongside one another, which is a bit different than is typical in migration studies, in which we often focus on a single group, might really kind of reveal further the contours of race and belonging, and how each of these groups really negotiated their spot on the frontier. And each of these remains prominent up to the present day. I want to turn to kind of three images, very current images, to start off this talk before we roll back in time, that kind of gives you a sense of the presence of these settler communities. This one is from 2019, at which point then President Evo Morales, Bolivia's first Indigenous president, who was ousted just a few months later in October of that year, met with a member of the Japanese imperial family, Princess Mako, that visited the country to celebrate the 120th anniversary of Japanese colonization and settlement in Bolivia. And that celebration, those festivities certainly included a trip to Okinawa colony as well, to the east of, northeast of the city of Santa Cruz. And you can get a sense then, right, this settler community is also kind of bound up in the international relations of both Bolivia and Japan up to the present. Another image took place, the photo taken just a little bit later that summer, shows Evo Morales now meeting with a large group of Mennonites. This is in Paurito, just about maybe 20 kilometers southeast of the city of Santa Cruz, and kind of a gateway to four of the large Mexican origin Mennonite colonies established in the 1960s. So he's now on the campaign trail leading up to this very disputed October election, and meets with Mennonites in the region. And this symbolic embrace, the picture, I had to do a little bit more digging, as you do. You always have to be aware for fake news, altered photos. And I discovered that Morales was not, in fact, wearing a characteristic pair of Mennonite overalls when the photo was taken. These were cleverly photoshopped in by a Twitter user after the fact. So this was the original photo. But again, you can kind of get the sense of Mennonite engagement with national politics. And here in this, at the same moment, just a photo taken shortly thereafter, you can see an individual, Abraham, who I actually interviewed, who moved to Bolivia from Mexico as a young boy, symbolically presenting Morales with a gift of cheese, a token of Mennonite production, which is kind of a repeated practice you see throughout Mennonite history in Bolivia, right? Demonstrating their agricultural production for the region. Now, if we shift to a third set of photos, these were taken about a year later, or just less than a year later, when Morales triumphantly returned to the country. He was ousted. It was considered by some to be a coup. others to be the result of a disputed election. He lived in exile in Mexico and Argentina for the following year. And then after his political party, not himself, won the new presidential elections with a resounding majority, he triumphantly returned. And he traveled straight, not to La Paz, the administrative capital, but straight to the lowland frontiers, to the Chimoré, one of the settler colonies that he himself had arrived in as a colonist years earlier, and where his political base was quite strong. And indeed, hundreds of thousands of people gathered from settler colonies, many of whom had really protested against his ouster the year before, to welcome Morales back. Here you can see him alongside his then previous vice president, Alvaro Garcia Linera, addressing the crowd. So, if the Japanese, ceremonial encounter, the Mennonite gift of cheese indicate the presence and sort of engagement of those settlers with national politics. Of course, here we do see the political strength of indigenous Bolivians who have migrated historically down to the frontiers of the country on the edge of the Amazon basin over the preceding 50, 60 years, almost 70 years now. So I hope I've made the case to start off that Bolivia is a compelling region to study for comparative analysis of migration. And I kind of want to zoom in now in the rest of the talk to think about how these different, very distinct migrant groups, not simply Mennonites, arrived in the country, what they experienced as they kind of negotiated with national governmental authorities, people in the institutes of colonization and ministries of agriculture, and also how they encountered ideas about race and development in their interactions with primarily local elites based in the small city of Santa Cruz de la Sierra, but people who still had a very strong pull in the agricultural rural regions of that part of Bolivia as well. So to begin this story, despite earlier attempts to really kind of colonize its frontier, we can't think about this apart from Bolivia's 1952 revolution. This was one of the iconic, though perhaps understudied, social revolutions in Latin American 20th century history. Coalition of miners, workers, and politicians ousted the tin oligarchy, which had dominated Bolivia for much of its independent history, and they enacted some pretty well-studied and sweeping reforms. They did things like nationalize the mines. Bolivia is one of the largest producers of tin in the world at this point in time. They enfranchised indigenous Bolivians, who constituted the majority of the population. They broke up the large estates in the highlands, not necessarily in the lowlands, through a process of agrarian reform. But what's interesting for us is this other process, which has continued long after the revolutionary government fell out of power in a coup in 1964, and that is the March to the East, the Marcha hacia el Oriente, which was this plan to colonize lowland Bolivia. And this idea about sending people to the frontier, I'll show you some images here in a second, really captivated Bolivian elites. And they saw it in unabashedly paternalistic terms. When they talked about indigenous Bolivians in the highlands, they regularly used the phrase during the revolutionary period, to make the Indian a citizen was the goal of the revolution, whether they were talking about public health or colonization or education. So this paternalistic notion of development, but what they really kind of saw themselves doing was sending people down to the frontier. Those people would transform landscape, but they themselves would also be transformed and become new sort of citizens on behalf of the state. So that's the national story and the national perspective. But what's kind of surprising about all of this is that the very earliest moments of the revolution, if you traveled into revolutionary ministries that were just being created up in La Paz, this sort of frantic energy of the early revolutionary era, you'd find these other transnational currents and individuals wandering the halls in government ministries. Indeed, just in the months after the 52 revolution and right after the mining decree was passed, nationalizing the mines, a group of 6 Mennonites, and this probably sounds familiar given the history of Mennonite delegations scouting new land, but 6 Mennonites arrive in Santa Cruz in a chartered plane. They've just come from across the Gran Chaco, so in neighboring Paraguay, from the Mennonite colonies there established in the 20s and 30s. And they're scouting out new opportunities. And we get kind of a view of this. I've got a few more images here of this highland-lowland dynamic. Some of them very crude, simplistic, some of them made on films. We get an image of the Mennonite participation in all of this through Menoblatt, the very small newspaper published in the Paraguayan Mennonite colony of Fernheim. And author Peter Regier describes their experience meeting government officials. When you think potentially with an audience of individuals who had left the Soviet Union under collectivization, they might have been a bit concerned about this social revolution, but Regier wasn't worried at all. He found the government receptive to their requested privileges, pacifism, ability to not serve in the military, manage their own education. And he talked a lot about the new infrastructure projects that were being developed in the lowlands, the different crops they could grow. He said, kind of a characteristic way, I'll quote him, "In the fields of agriculture down the frontier," he concluded, "sinfully little has been done, but the prospects are unexpectedly large." So this Mennonite story immediately immersed in this revolutionary project. It wasn't the only one. The very following year, as Bolivia was in the process of enacting its agrarian reform law, redistributing massive amounts of land in the highlands, we had another individual with a transnational tie petitioning the government. Jose Akamine, this was a Japanese Bolivian, a long resident of Riberalta in the rubber producing region of Bolivia. He'd come across from Peru as a migrant who was not happy with conditions in Peru in the early 20th century, approached the government with plans for what him and a few other Japanese Bolivians were calling the Aruma Society. So they'd bought about 50,000 hectares of land in Santa Cruz, and they were prepared to welcome in, as they described it, thousands of Okinawan families from war-torn, post-war Okinawa. They wanted to use this as a humanitarian outreach to bring in these people that they were made aware of were in quite desperate straits in the post-war period. So it might seem surprising on the one hand, or perhaps not surprising at all that we have these transnational threads playing out in Bolivia. If we expand back historically, we can see these diasporas, Mennonite and Okinawan, regularly overlapping throughout the Americas. Indeed, if we think about the origins of those two diasporas, we can kind of see them emerging at the same time. In the 1870s, when what is probably well known for us, right, Russian reforms related to military service and language changes lead a migration to Canada, which then prompts a later migration into Latin America. In those same decades in that same decade, the 1870s, is when Okinawa is forcibly incorporated into Japan as a prefecture and experiences a very rapid push for cultural assimilation based on dress, language, customs, all sorts of different practices. And Okinawans, as they see their economy restructured towards an extractive sugarcane economy with profits going to Japan, start to look for opportunities to migrate. They travel to Hawaii as sugarcane workers, they travel across the Pacific, and gradually this diaspora emerges. And if we look at a side-by-side map, I don't know how well you can see this depending on what screen you're viewing it on. On the left, we have the Mennonite diaspora in the Americas. On the right, we have the evolving Okinawan diaspora. You can see again, right, a little surprised that these individuals from these communities are both looking for opportunities on the frontiers of new nations. And that's a compelling aspect. They're driven in ways that they would describe by processes of assimilation or victimization, certainly by the forces of nationalism. At the same time, they're really engaging as agents of national development, internal colonialism in a lot of these new contexts. Some people refer to this as a kind of a form of sub-imperialism. So that broad history, I hope, gives us a sense of, why Akamine or Regier both end up in La Paz petitioning the government right after the revolution. But I want to kind of continue the story and think about the specific conditions in the 1950s that drew those two foreign groups, as well as Indigenous Bolivians from the highlands, down to Santa Cruz to become frontier farmers. And so I want to kind of zoom in on some of these, on these three different locations, the Andes, Okinawa, and in the case of Mennonites, primarily northern Mexico as the main origin point, to kind of see what other overlaps we can uncover, right? And what I note is that we see uncertain citizenship statuses in each of these cases. We see challenging landscapes, or at least ideas that these landscapes are difficult, environmentally fraught. We see questions about population pressures and labor migration. And again, it allows for, not a way to simply collapse these stories and say that they're the same, but to see these productive entanglements, these different groups. So a view from Okinawa, comes to us in the 1950s courtesy of James Tigner. Tigner was a sociologist, and I've got a massive report here because I couldn't find an image, but it produced a giant report at the behest of the U.S. military. and basically was looking for new strategies for resettling Okinawans. The context, for those of us that aren't familiar with post-war Okinawa, was that the US had claimed sovereignty over Okinawa, the island of Okinawa, and the other islands in that prefecture in the archipelago from Japan in 1951, signing the peace treaty, and was in the process of expropriating land to construct military bases with the eye to current and future conflicts it imagined itself to be fighting in East Asia. So about a third of the arable land on Okinawa is taken up at this point in time. There's intense protests Okinawans engage in to try and slow the scale of land acquisition. They're not successful in their immediate aims, but if we want to think about some evocative examples, in one case, Okinawans are permitted to go in and harvest the crops that they have grown in their village before bulldozers demolish it to create an airfield. They refuse to do so. US soldiers are brought in to harvest the crops for them. And in protest, the Okinawans, led by a prominent socialist politician, Senaga, throw the cabbages and the other harvested crops underneath the treads of the advancing bulldozers. And we see protests like this taking place throughout the islands. And it really drives the US not to stop land acquisition, but to really look for a new alternative, a place that they can send Okinawans, or at least to relieve some of this population pressure. And that comes up in sociologist James Tigner's report. He describes the landscape of the islands in the following terms, and I'll just read from him here. He says they have been a deficit area owing to a shortage of arable land, low-grade soils, virtually no exploitable natural resources, and severe population pressure for generations. They offer no more than a marginal near-famine living standard. So Tigner was largely silent in this massive report on the US land acquisitions that were driving this, but he described the landscape as a deficient one, as an overpopulated one, as one in need of relocation. And this report came out in 1954. And what's interesting, if we want to search for comparisons, is in that exact same year, members of Bolivia's National Revolutionary Movement, in particular Walter Guevara Arce, this sort of intellectual leader of the MNR, are discussing the Andes in almost exactly the same way. He writes a massive report about plans to resettle indigenous Bolivians who are being laid off from the mines, who are not able to get land through agrarian reform down on the lowlands. And he comes up with this spatial sort of demographic logic. He writes that the Andes, comprising just a third of the national territory of Bolivia, holds 72% of the population, and writes that this is a space constituted in its majority by sterile and poor land. And it wasn't just the government in Bolivia that was thinking about the landscape in this way. The Bolivian state received petitions from individuals living in these Western Highland departments that also described their region as, quote, extremely unfavorable to agriculture, or another petition, a frigid and narrow place surrounded by suffering on all sides. So these individuals also petitioned for rights to take part in colonization projects. We see then population pressure and ideas about landscape playing out in Okinawa and in the Andes. If we flip our perspective over to northern Mexico, we see very similar factors at play. And those come courtesy of another sociologist well known to Mennonite historians, J.W. Fretz, who traveled to Mennonite colonies in Mexico in the 1940s and wrote a report, a very short pamphlet for the MCC, describing intense conditions, generational conditions of landlessness in these rapidly growing colonies, the inability to purchase land, in competition with surrounding campesino communities, and really saw this as a bit of a time bomb that was waiting to erupt. And it was in the following decade that we see a profound environmental crisis piling on top of this pre-existing landlessness situation. Northern Mexico in particular, experiences a prolonged decade-plus long drought through all of the early 1950s. It kind of ebbs and flows, but continues into the 1960s. And we see in response petitions from lawyers that work with Mennonite colonists, writing to the president, asking for a reduction in taxes. This individual, Daniel Salas Lopez, he says, the Mennonite colonists didn't ask me to write this, but I'm writing on their behalf anyways, because for lack of rains, they have lived with positive sacrifice and taken out bank loans to meet necessities. So as a result of environmental, population, and political factors, all three of these groups, Andeans, Mennonites, and Okinawans, are on the move, or looking to move in the 1950s and into the 1960s. What's compelling here again is we see some other commonalities in terms of migrant labor that precede the migration of these three groups down into Santa Cruz. Mennonites, as we'll probably be familiar with in our context in Canada, look north before they look south down to Bolivia. And significant numbers, small but significant, begin to migrate up to southern Manitoba to host sugar beets. They travel to southwest Ontario to pick tomatoes and cucumbers. Through the 50s and into the 60s, it kind of consolidates as a survival strategy to send money back home, but also an increasing population that looks to obtain their Canadian citizenship formally to stay in the country. And this produces, an anxiety, you could say, or maybe even a slight hostility to jump ahead here on the part of the Canadian government. And I've just picked out an archival record here in which you can see the Canadian embassy in Mexico City, writing to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Ottawa. I'm describing this situation, and I'll read a little bit from it as I think it's appropriate. The embassy writes, with an increasing awareness of the advantage of a Canadian passport, the number of Mennonites who take trouble to maintain Canadian citizenship is growing. As a result, every year there will be more Canadians in Chihuahua. I cannot believe that it was the intention of the Canadian Citizenship Act of 47 that German-speaking Mennonites living in Mexico should maintain citizenship from generation to generation in order to have a passport of convenience. Mexican Mennonites are Canadian in this legal sense only and in no other way. So we see transnational labor migration across borders pulling Mennonites north. In another compelling thread, prior to migrating down to the lowlands as frontier farmers, Bolivians living in the Andes are actually also traveling to work in the sugar economy in these same years, in the 1950s and 1960s, but on a much, much larger scale. And most of them are coming into northwestern Argentina, which you can kind of see from the map here, borders on Potosi and these highland departments that are being described in these kind of desperate ways in the 1950s. The movement, as I said, is massive. Estimates by Bolivian officials are that 200,000 Bolivians are crossing the border every year to make this annual pilgrimage into northwestern Argentina. One official, the same person that wrote this plan for Bolivian development, calls it akin to the evacuation of a major European city during the war. Some people describe these Bolivians as nomads without a homeland. They denounce what they call the subhuman material and social conditions they're living in, and they describe it as sort of a shameful current of depopulation. Their initiative in the end for the Bolivian government is to redirect this stream away from Argentina, this loss of valuable laboring bodies in their mind, and push it down onto the lowland frontier. So we have Mennonites experiencing challenge with citizenship claims. We have Bolivians crossing borders, many of them undocumented, some contracted as former laborers. Okinawans, if we're to return to this end of the story, also experienced challenges in the 1950s as they start to think about migrating to Latin American destinations as proposed by Tigner and the US military. About 42,000 people gather in Naha, the administrative capital of Okinawa, to apply for permission to migrate. They're not all able to go at once, but one of the main challenges they face is this question about citizenship and passports, which is also kind of bedeviling the Canadian embassy in regard to Mennonites from Mexico. And that is that the US, while claiming sovereignty over Okinawa, has not extended citizenship to Okinawans, yet has cut the ties of Japanese citizenship from them. In a sense, Okinawans don't really have a status, and the US government starts to issue them with these certificates of identity, which foreign governments are not willing to accept. And so as we see Okinawans moving into places like Bolivia, they try and pass off these certificates of identity with all sorts of different challenges. One US general, the commander of the US forces in Japan, they talk about this a lot, writes, most Okinawans think they remain full-fledged Japanese citizens. Others are confused and regard themselves almost as stateless persons with no official allegiance. Even in Bolivia, the government there refers to the Okinawans as neither fish nor fowl because they don't seem to know whether they can go to the US consular officials for help or the Japanese consular officials in Santa Cruz and in La Paz. So this kind of wanted to give you a sense of this fraught history of these three groups as they come to settle on the frontier. And now, kind of in the time that's left, I want to turn to their experiences as they come into Santa Cruz. How do they present themselves to local elites and to government officials? How do their experiences reflect ideas about race and belonging? In terms of the Mennonites, race is talked about essentially by not talking about race. Mennonites, as they arrive from Paraguay, don't encounter a racialized resistance, and they're able, when they obtain their first decree of freedom of practice, the privilegium from the Bolivian government in 1954, to present themselves in harmony with the aims of the national revolution. It's actually written directly into the decree that because these are the such and such goals of the revolution to increase agricultural development, it's worth tolerating, quote, Mennonites' peculiar customs and habits. And we see a second mini wave in 57 of Mennonites come in, and they present a pretty elaborate justification for their presence. They hire a Bolivian lawyer who travels to La Paz, and he presents their claim to the president, members of Congress, and the Ministry of Agriculture. And the letter is kind of interesting again, to note. It has this sort of flourish to it, which is a bit ironic if you're familiar with these individuals themselves. He says that these new Mennonites from Paraguay will populate the land and develop agriculture under scientific methods. They'll form an agricultural cooperative, introducing specialized machinery, improving methods of production with imported seeds from Canada, establish training schools for the instruction of specialized agriculture and ranching for surrounding farmers. So there's no recorded opposition, but the migrants themselves, as sociologist Fretz will later discover when he visits them in the 1960s, are actually among some of the poorest from the Chaco Mennonite colonies in Paraguay. It's interesting to see how they're able to present themselves in this way, in this sort of framework of the scientific modern farmer, despite the actual conditions, which a few years later are revealed even in outward signs, Fretz says, of malnutrition among some of these children, who I later interviewed as adults in Bolivia. It's not until the 1960s, when the first migrants are coming in from Mexico in 67 and 68, that we see an active, bit more contested debate around Mennonite migration into the country. We have a series of dueling editorials written in favor and in opposition to Mennonite migrants. The first one kind of comes away and says, Mennonites are going to form separate nuclei within our country. They refuse to speak our language. They shun us Bolivians. And it ends on this kind of dire note. It says, soon Bolivians will not even own an inch of their own native land. Fortunately for these Mennonite settlers, they have powerful allies within the Institute of Colonization. The head of the institute, which is responsible for managing lowland colonies in the 60s, is in strong support for Mennonites. And he, in an open editorial to the Bolivian public, rejects the earlier assertions about them. He says, Mennonites are going to free more men to go to war by producing food for the nation, and thereby, it doesn't matter that they don't serve in the military. He points to the example of the Chaco War, saying that this was the reason that Paraguay had actually defeated Bolivia in the conflict in the 1930s, in his opinion, and therefore we should now take these individuals in as well. He talks about Mennonites as by religion bound to the land, assuaging fears that they might move into cities and take up urban jobs, and finally kind of concludes, what does it matter if they don't assimilate? We do not invite them here in order to socialize. The important thing is that they work and make our lands produce. Behind the scenes, the discussion is a little more critical in the Institute of Colonization. Some people, again, are just repeatedly sort of arguing, these lands shouldn't be given to Mennonites. They should be given to potentially returning migrants from Argentina who are resettling, or internal migrants from the highlands. But the sort of ending logic, if we look at I'll jump ahead of these expedientes, the case files for both the Canadian Mennonite colony, and here you see on the right, the Mennonite colony Rio Palacio, the first from Mexico, is especially in the latter case that Mennonite investment as well, that they're going to come in with significant capital from selling their property in Mexico, justifies their presence on these particular lands, which are not suitable for development without drilling wells. And the Mennonites are going to be able to do this in short order. So it's interesting, in the same defense of Mennonites by the head of the Institute of Colonization, he also takes a moment to pause and defend Japanese and Okinawan settlers who are experiencing attacks as well by local elites and by some government officials. The interesting thing here, of course, is that the discussion immediately pivots not to from development and agriculture and sort of scientific production towards explicit discussions of race. And the head of the Institute of Colonization writes in his defense, in reflecting, I'll note, the racial pessimism quite common among elites in Bolivia at the time, that Bolivia is basically composed of Indians or mixtures in which the indigenous blood is predominant. He notes the argument that the Bolivian race could be made worse by mixing with other races can hardly be accepted. So we have this rather pessimistic view. The US government, in the case of these Okinawans, is also responsible, the military, for their settlement. And they're eager to kind of gauge the response of different Bolivian individuals. They get a positive one from the U.S. Ambassador, or the Bolivian ambassador in Washington. Victor Andrade says that Bolivia admires Okinawans' courage, diligence, willingness to work, and adaptability. But they also take part in their own investigation of local attitudes in Santa Cruz. And they note, interestingly enough, that people of the working class are indifferent largely to the Okinawan settlement, but among the Creole middle and upper class, though they admire perhaps this work ethic, as has been noted, they explicitly favor European migration, and they fear intermarriage that they, quote, this is from the embassy's report, would weaken the racial stock of Santa Cruz. So essentially they don't want Japanese and Okinawan migrants to assimilate in. This is kind of interesting because the simultaneous discussion in the Institute of Colonization is that these migrants are not suitable because they won't assimilate and they will maintain themselves as, and I quote another Institute record here, racial islands living in Santa Cruz. So assimilation or non-assimilation flips back and forth. Meanwhile, the very prominent notion of immigration as a form of racial whitening, which is present in Latin America before World War II, but lingers on in the post-war period in certain sectors, continues to be present in Santa Cruz. So if you read editorials from that city at the time, you'll see individuals pining for Italians, they say, or Germans from the south of Brazil, like as in the south of Brazil, Arab settlers that have come to southern Brazil as well, as opposed to, they say, these Japanese migrants. Another kind of tactic they've taken against Japanese and Okinawan migration is to refer again to this current of Bolivians living in Argentina. And to say essentially that we should return these braceros, they're called, or laborers, back to the patria and resettle them in Santa Cruz before we turn to a foreign element in the service of developing agriculture. These are appearing in editorials at the time. It's a bit of a disingenuous claim from the perspective of local elites who don't, in fact, view Indigenous Bolivians from the highlands as fellow Bolivians, but as a separate community in racialized terms. Indeed, a year after they're making this argument in 55, that we need to return migrants from Argentina to Bolivia instead of inviting in the Japanese, the same paper, the same editorialist publishes an article titled "The Latest Novelty: Colonizers That Decolonize," in reference to a new Indigenous Andean colony that's established, coincidentally, you can see on the dots here, number 10, right across the Akamine River from one of the major Japanese colonies, number 5. The paper claims that these new Indigenous Bolivian settlers are destroying the once flourishing estates and property tradition. And so there is this strong tension between Indigenous Bolivians as they migrate in more substantial numbers down to the frontiers. What we also see is an environmental argument about incompatibility. Repeatedly said that the Japanese are foreign to our environment, and in the terms of Indigenous Bolivians, that they can't survive and thrive with the rigors of the tropic. Tellingly, there's never a reference in these documents to the environmental arguments being made to oppose Mennonite settlement. Those sometimes hinge on questions about assimilation or privilege, but never in these sort of racialized environmental tones, despite the fact that Mennonites are arriving, of course, from a history of temperate zone farming and more recently from arid but higher elevation northern Mexico. So in the last, I guess about 8 or 9 minutes here, I kind of want to conclude with how these dynamics that are taking place in the earliest years of settlement for Mennonites, Andeans, and Okinawans in Bolivia emerge over time. And how do they consolidate their positions, right? There's different models of what a farmer is supposed to be doing down on the frontier. They can be a 50-hectare, small but mechanized, market-driven farmer. That's kind of the goal for almost all of these individuals that are coming down. But there's also space for people to be, medium-sized, 100, 150-hectare farmers, or even large agro-industrial operations. And as we break down the groups, we can see Okinawans and Japanese kind of trending towards the latter. They're able, over the following decades, to really kind of alleviate this intense racism of the post-war period and establish themselves as acknowledged agricultural specialists in the region. And they do this through a pretty active process of inviting local elites, when they have these damning editorials written in the press, they invite the editorialists to visit their colony, tour the colony. They invite people. You can see here an image from the 10th anniversary of the Okinawan colony. So always national and local officials are brought in. And they present themselves as productive farmers that are transforming the land. The reality is a bit more murky. The settlements that the Okinawans take part in are at times a disaster. The first settlement has to be moved. The second is nearly wiped out by a flood. I've got some images here in 1968. Okinawans are actually picked up by helicopter in some cases from the rooftops of their thatched huts. But that is also, a bit more complicated. Another thing that's taking place at this point in time is that Okinawans are desperate just to leave. Many feel like they've been dumped in Santa Cruz against their will. Just they wanted to get off the islands, and this was their one ticket. And they know there's a much larger and more established Japanese population in Brazil. And one individual who I interviewed, this was the president of Okinawa Colony 3, said his daily job, or weekly job rather, in addition to farming his plot, was traveling from the colony, not insubstantial distance down to Santa Cruz, to intercept fellow colonists who are trying to take the train line out to Brazil and just exit the situation altogether. So while it doesn't seem like a colony that's on the verge of prospering, the strange reality is that in the wake of this disastrous flood we talk about, it coincides with the point in which, at least in Bolivia, Japan is once again able to administer development assistance to the Okinawan colonists. The US start to grant some sovereignty back, and eventually fully by 1972. And so we have a huge increase in support for mechanization among the Okinawan colonists by the Japanese government. At the same time, that flood of about a third of the population of the colonies who can't stand this environment and leave for Brazil actually opens up more farmland for these newly mechanized farmers to farm on. And so Japanese and Okinawan settlers both actually emerge as quite successful, highly centralized cooperatives and powerful agro-industrial producers over the following year. We can go on about that, but we'll leave that aside for now. Turning to the Mennonite settlers, right? They come in the sort of narrative that they themselves tell, right? In resistance to certain technological innovations, rubber tires on tractors, cars, etc. But in the Bolivian context, they really emerge as a major mechanized force in regional production. Indeed, about a decade after Mennonites have arrived in the country, mostly through the activities of these transnational Mennonite traders who return to Canada and the US, or US primarily, to purchase farm equipment and ship it down there. About 10,000, 12,000 Mennonites have maybe 1,000 tractors between them, about double the entire rest of the rural population of Santa Cruz. And so Luddites, from one view, incredibly mechanized from another, right? And they start to pioneer production in non-traditional crops like soybeans, which become a major market in the region. We can see kind of that challenge then. An agronomist that visits the colonies in the 1970s that reports on this mechanization is still sort of wrestling with this idea: how would Mennonites potentially serve as a model for other farmers in the region, right? He says their social religious system makes it difficult to understand their experiences and systems of production and to pass these understandings on to the national producer. So finally, we need to turn back to the perspective of the Andeans, who have come in much larger numbers, in the hundreds of thousands by this point, with the promise that the government will support them, it will help them mechanize, receive title to their land, guarantee stable prices for these new commodities they're supposed to be producing, like rice and sugarcane. And this simply doesn't happen. Individuals continue to come down to these new colonies that are created, but they really struggle with inconsistent support and non-existent infrastructure to allow them to access regional markets, which are kind of monopolized again by a small elite group of traders. And they don't have the opportunity of sort of internal forms that are referred to here in this quote to guarantee their mechanization and development. They don't have the Japanese government to guarantee their support, and they often have to take much more radical steps. Some complain to the Bolivian government, specifically saying, the Japanese government is providing these funds for development. Like, why is the Bolivian government not engaging in similar aspects of promised support? But others eventually turn to radical forms of organization. They stage roadblocks, they stage protests. When promised infrastructure is not delivered, they sometimes kidnap international development experts or hold government officials temporarily hostage to push forward their demands. And they gain kind of a more radical sense of self-determination, which is very different than the pacifist presentation of agricultural production we're starting to see in these Mennonite and Okinawan colonies. What it ends up contributing to, and we'll just wrap up here in a minute, I think, as we're approaching 40 minutes, are these very polarized notions of foreign settlers who are kind of embraced by local elites as our foreigners, and then actual Bolivians who are perceived, at least in the lowland context of Santa Cruz, as outside invaders, as foreign invaders. And I just put up, one example from a local newspaper here. Again, Santa Cruz, you've referred to a bit, to show how this contrast is playing out by the 1980s. We see Japanese Mennonites described as pacifists, farmers producing for the land, and then other supposed colonists. This is referring to indigenous Bolivians from the highlands. Again, we see this environmental rationale playing out, that they don't supposedly possess the physical aptitude to grapple with the rigors of the tropics, and then references to some of these strategies that groups have resorted to in the complete absence of state support. So this understanding polarizes over time. And it plays out in different ways, kind of sometimes related to ideas of modernization. I haven't translated this section for you here, but here's another sort of systematic analysis of the different colonies, the national colonies, the Mennonite colonies, and the Japanese colonies in the country from a regional-based story development organization. And it struck me when I read it the first time. I almost had to read it again to make sure I hadn't mixed up the headings, that I wasn't reading Mennonite colonies under national colonies, because the national colonies are described as groups that reject change or innovation and observe isolation from surrounding society, right? Whereas those same characteristics are inverted a little bit in the Mennonite case in positive ways, even though we see that potentially being used to describe Mennonites. In the Mennonite case, it's written that they observe strong family cohesion, social and religious. They tend towards self-sufficiency. And even though they have a conservative and segregationist practice, they have favorable cultural values. So even development officials, as well as local elites, are kind of embracing these different notions about culture and modernization based on these sort of racial polarization of the region. Last thing I want to do before I conclude this talk is return to the question of the transnational, which is in this title, Transnational Revolution. The transnational isn't something in the story that actually just happens at the start, when all of those strange webs of sociologists and migrations and transborder labor processes are unfolding. It continues very much so in the present. And if we return to those three groups, we can really see that playing out. Here we have Satoshi Higa, a resident of Okinawa colony in Bolivia. And he remembers in the 1980s, in the midst of a brutal debt crisis, hyperinflation in Bolivia, almost every single person that he graduated with high school with in that decade traveled off to Japan, which had just changed its migration law in 1990. It formally changed it to allow Okinawans or Japanese descendants up to the third generation to travel back to Japan as laborers in industrial occupations. They were trying to fill a massive labor shortage, and they wanted people that were culturally familiar with all that implies. And so this became a huge driver. Okinawans, as he said, from his own colony were remitting income in this classic migrant labor pattern. And we can see very similar things happening with Andeans, indigenous Andeans who migrated again down into Argentina, not just into the sugar harvest this time, but all the way down into Buenos Aires, worked construction, and sent money back home as well to support operations in Bolivia. And to conclude it with the Mennonite example, right? Even this individual we showed at the beginning, Abraham, who presents the gift cheese to Evo Morales, a real kind of classic sign of Mennonites as rooted, grounded producers for the Bolivian nation, had actually, like many of his contemporaries, traveled up north to Ontario, get an Ontario license plate hanging on the wall of his shop in the 2000s, and earn enough money to buy the farm on which that cheese was produced. And so the transnational, to conclude, continues to unfold in this context. And I'll stop my share there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ben, for that fascinating presentation. And now I'm just going to remind everyone, please put any questions that you might have into the question box. And we already have one question from Blake Ham. Thank you, Blake, for starting us off. And he wants you to expand on this paradox between conservative Mennonites trying to flee worldly institutions, but then playing such an important role in consolidating that territory and in settling and colonizing that region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the persistent paradox that we deal with when we study Mennonite history, not simply in Latin America, although it's abundantly apparent in the region, Blake. And I'm glad you pointed that out. If we think about, for instance, Mennonites arriving in Mexico, they come in the immediate wake of 10 years of bloody revolutionary struggle, when ideas about property, land ownership, faith are all up in the air, right? And they arrive in the most violent, contested state of the revolutionary process. When we look to Paraguay, of course, we also see this unfolding in the context of the Chaco War, and no surprise, another revolution in Bolivia that institutes this. And I think it simply challenges us on the one hand to view any community as separate from the world. I think really the onus on us as scholars is to seek out those connections, and to think about how people engage and negotiate often these revolutionary movements. And I can say, from having spent time in Rio Palacio, the largest and oldest Mexican origin Mennonite colony in Bolivia, that individuals are well aware of these global connections in their daily lives. They don't consider themselves to be apart from them. They keep tabs on global soy prices. They're aware of developments at the national level, and when they see these challenges play out, they're often quite proactive in dealing with them in one form or another. And so that's another thing that I've definitely noted. Whether that's petitioning the government, contracting local legal counsel, migrating transnationally to look for new opportunities. Individuals I spoke with were traveling to peanut experimental stations in South Georgia because they were considering introducing new crops. And so it really sort of shifted my sense of what constituted the world of these colonists through doing that research. But I think as opposed to the "aha, gotcha, you actually are connected," response, I think what I like to see is to really play that out to its fullest extent and look for all of these interconnections, or entanglements, I think is the term migration historians often use to describe them.
So our next question comes from Richard Radsleff, who says, you mentioned that there was a coup in 1964, but it seems that government attitudes to colonization don't change. Can you comment on this? And also, why would a government, the 1952 government, favorable to Indigenous rights, promote colonization of Indigenous lands?
Those are two fantastic questions, Richard. Thank you so much. So to answer the first question, for scholars that I, kind of met in the archives, a lot of us were working on the 52 revolution. It was something that kind of inspired, I think, new interest. So people writing about water politics and agrarian reform and public health, and in my case, colonization. I think the tendency is to really kind of bookend these revolutionary movements and kind of see them, as definitive aspects of change, or sometimes even to argue that, the revolution had already petered out by whatever year, right, 57 or 58, and it was just a last gasp when it was finally taken over by a coup in 64. And I get that certainly from a political perspective about transitioning from one regime to another. And those changes were very significant for individuals, some of whom were targeted and persecuted by the authoritarian governments that followed. But no, I think the continuity you've viewed is persistent across regimes, and we see an environmental attitude towards Bolivia and towards its resources, and especially towards its lowland frontier, based on a notion of extractivism that persists. And so it persists from the revolutionary government, and then we have a period from 64 all the way into 83 of dictatorship in Bolivia, quite ruthless dictatorship in the 1970s, in which new rounds of development happen in the lowlands. By the time we get into what we consider the neoliberal era of the 1980s, with a lot of structural reforms, those governments are still pushing lowland developments. And even our Indigenous president from 2005 to 2019, Evo Morales, who sort of really advocated an environmentalist strategy, continued really unabated to push lowland development, both supporting elite extraction, kind of if you think of soybeans and things like that, and also supporting new rounds of settlers that were coming down. He himself was a settler, as I mentioned earlier, that had come down as part of this process. And that probably gets us to the other question that you raised, about, I guess, the government committed to protecting Indigenous rights. On the other hand, displacing Indigenous groups on the lowland. And I think that reflects a bit of the territorial polarization as well in Bolivia. Indeed, under the Morales government more recently, we have seen that to be the case, that we have this environmentalist rhetoric, we have development plans focused on the lowland frontier at the same time, about opening up new land for colonization. And there's been, I think, a very inspiring pushback. Lowland Indigenous communities have really organized since the 1970s, when that frontier moved from pretty close to Santa Cruz out into a broad swath of territory, in which there were large Indigenous communities present, to contest it and to ensure protection for Indigenous territories, known as TCOs in Bolivia now. So we've seen a pushback against that.
So while other people are formulating their questions, maybe I'll just jump in with one. And you talked about the significance of race, and I appreciate you mentioning that it's significant even though Mennonites aren't talking about race, even though it's not maybe something how they would use in their own conversation. But can you just expand on if racial attitudes play a role in how Mennonites interact with their neighbors in this particular context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Eileen. That's another interesting, challenging question to think about, because as you said, you don't always get explicit notions of race. I think on the one hand, just from the perspective of them arriving, Mennonites, yes, are not often described in racial terms, although they are kind of racialized alongside other Europeans who are discussed in very positive terms in this binary notion of race. As far as how Mennonites themselves understand their position in the country, there's a profound dynamic, as I've alluded to in the last question, of highland-lowland interaction here, right? So Highlanders, often described as Koyas, encounter lowlanders, Gambas, through the process of colonization, and there's a real racial polarization between those two groups. And this is evident in all sorts of ways, right? Practical aspects of discrimination, sometimes violence during political crisis moments. And I think, and even jokes and humor in the region, right? In Santa Cruz, where about a quarter of the population was born in another part of Bolivia, almost exclusively in the highlands. Mennonites I talked to sometimes were aware of those jokes. They were aware of kind of how they might fit themselves, or they might be perceived in relation to those communities. And so the stereotypical notion of Highlanders is this sort of, positive, spun in one way, or almost rapacious aspect of them being hardworking, kind of a bit ruthless in their hardworkingness. And we can see Mennonites describing the ways in which they've been likened in some senses to Koyas, to these Highlanders that are coming in. At other times, people kind of embrace aspects of this lowlander Kamba identity. So the racial polarization, this is what I think all migrant groups end up kind of doing, is thinking about how they fit on this spectrum in the receiving societies.
Okay, we also have a question from Sandra Thompson, and she thanks you for the informative talk. And she mentions that in her research, the term colonize means unjust treatment of Indigenous peoples. As you use colonize, it seems to mean development, which is desired by the government of nations to which Mennonites travel to establish these colonies, and that you point out how welcome Mennonites are for their way of contributing to the use of supposed unoccupied, unused spaces, and have you investigated the perspective of the Indigenous peoples and the people of the land that are occupied by Mennonite colonies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the term, first of all, certainly colonization is widespread in the literature, in the sources at the time, to describe these projects, to name the institutes that are governmental institutes that are responsible for managing it. And I think this has also been something that I should point out has been an aspect of debate in Bolivia. Members of agrarian unions that have come down from the highlands to the lowlands have often actually gone through a process of altering their name. They're referred to typically as colonizadores, colonizers in the past, and have made kind of an argument that one can't colonize one's own territory. We could contest that in terms of internal colonialism, but that is an argument that's been made, and it's often in Bolivia, these individuals are referred to as interculturales, that they have had this intercultural experience by moving between highland and lowland. And it's, that's a fraught definition, depending upon who looks at it. But that's one way, the notion of colonizer is sort of evolved over time. In terms of Mennonites' experiences, this is a big topic to think about in terms of a long history of lowland displacement of Indigenous peoples, which of course has a colonial history dating back into the Spanish colonial era. A lot of Indigenous peoples like the Guarani and the Guarayos were sort of concentrated on missions originally run by the Jesuits, later turned over to the Franciscans. And it's right before colonization takes place, before the 52 Revolution, when those last remaining missions are secularized. So they're broken up, and individuals are presumably going to continue to work some of the fields around them from these Indigenous communities. But what we see in the 40s and 50s is a monopolization of a lot of Indigenous labor in forms that are sometimes directly comparable to slavery or debt peonage on these large estates held by lowland elites. So that's not necessarily the format that Mennonites or Okinawans or small Indigenous settlers are coming into, right? They're not employing, or coercively at times, these Indigenous laborers. What starts to happen, though, over time, is that as settlement expands, it pushes further and further into traditional Indigenous territories at a moment in the late 70s when these groups start to politically organize under the conference. It's originally of the Indigenous Peoples of Eastern Bolivia, but now the Indigenous Peoples of Bolivia Conference, and they push back and seek return of their lands. So the first lands that are returned, if we want to use that term, to lowland Indigenous groups start to take place in the 1990s. And now we have these TCOs all across the lowlands. Some of them have been in conflict with the government, the national government recently, because of attempts to build roads through them. But there has been a space for Indigenous sovereignty in the lowlands of Bolivia. Mennonites, because their settlement was initially primarily in the area around Santa Cruz, didn't have as many early encounters with these groups in terms of conflicts over land. But this did change. In the 2000s, we had a group of Guarani claiming a peri-urban space quite close to where that image of Evo Morales meeting with the Mennonites was taken, and actually involved in a conflict, which was for a period of time violent between the Mennonite community there and the Guarani. And it was eventually resolved with a turnover of land. We've seen, in terms of Guarani living further south, so near Charagua, a different sort of relationship with Mennonites, and MCC has actually been involved directly in kind of what we could consider aspects of reconciliation or mutual cooperation between Mennonite colonies in that region. Those are primarily from Mexico and the Guarani, who are the largest Indigenous group in that area, and who have just recently actually gained the first Indigenous autonomous municipality in Bolivia through a process of political reform. So they're complex and different situations. We do see conflict as well as aspects of cooperation.
Thank you for that answer. And Sandra has just one follow-up to her question, which is, do you see any analogy between the way in which Mennonite colonies immigrated to Bolivia and their immigration and colonization in the prairies?
I think the ability to secure privileges and access to land and to gain allies within the government, certainly we can see parallels there. And again, if we think about lowland Indigenous communities who, after those missions were secularized, were supposed to receive land and did not necessarily, and were forced into coercive labor relationships, there's certainly comparisons to be made there. And I look forward, just as a side note, to teaching this next year a course on Indigenous Mennonite relations, which will hopefully draw some of these parallels further between the Canadian, Russian, and Latin American US contexts.
Well, thank you, Ben. On behalf of all the people who can't speak for themselves, I'd like to thank you for that very informative presentation and great answers to the questions that were asked. And so that will conclude our segment for today. But before we go, I'd like to also thank Evan, who is doing our behind the scenes tech on this webinar, and also Jeremy Weeb, who helped organize this event. And please note that CTMS has a number of upcoming events, including in partnership with MCC. There'll be a conference, MCC at 100. Ben, do you want to say just a couple of words about the conference for people?
Yeah, no, we've got a fantastic lineup, and we'll be providing registration link, early registration link for that quite soon. And so, the conference again will reflect the global scope of MCC operations over the years. I look forward to talking a little bit about MCC in Bolivia. We have great work being done all over, and that we look forward to a remote delivery for that conference after much discussion, given the uncertainty of the current pandemic, and the fact that we have many fantastic presenters coming across borders from the US, but also from Europe and other regions. So we'll make sure we have a smooth online delivery with ample room to engage with the panelists in the fall.
Yeah, so that'll be September 30th to October 2nd will be when the conference will happen. And at some point, we will have a celebration for Dr. Royden Lowen, who is the former chair in Mennonite Studies. So don't think that we just kicked him out the door. Yeah. We will acknowledge his illustrious career with an event sponsored by CTMS once things get back to normal. So thank you, everyone, for attending this lecture, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Aileen.